He thought his new homestead promised quiet and peace, but in the shadows of the hills waited towering widows bound by old traditions. When the eldest said, "The breeding starts tonight," it left only one question: had he stepped into a nightmare of survival, or into a destiny that would tie his life to theirs forever? The trail stretched endlessly beneath a copper-red sky, its dust clinging to boots, reins, and breath alike. Elias Vaynor rode in silence, the rhythmic creak of saddle leather, the only sound breaking the hush of the dying day. He had crossed mountains, rivers, and plains, with one single desire pressing his heart flat as hammered iron: peace. The letter in his saddlebag had promised just that: an abandoned homestead on the edge of a forgotten settlement called Hollow Creek. The seller claimed it was quiet, empty, a place where a man could hang his hat and let the world stop demanding from him. Elias had fought too many battles, on cattle trails, in mining camps, and in his own restless soul. He wanted walls that wouldn't betray him, land that would not bleed him dry, and silence to drown out memory. By twilight, the first outline of Hollow Creek emerged through the veil of dusk. A scatter of houses leaned against one another like drunks after last call. Fences sagged, doors hung from rusted hinges, and the main street was a scar of trampled dust. Not a soul stirred. No smoke, no lamps. Just silence and the faint moan of wind through broken shutters. Elias dismounted slowly, boots sinking into the powdery soil. His mare snorted, ears twitching, as though something in the place unsettled her. He patted her neck, steadying her, though truth be told, the unease coiled in him too. He studied the homestead that now belonged to him. A weathered farmhouse with missing boards, and a porch that seemed to sigh with every breath of wind. He stepped onto the porch, the boards groaning beneath his weight. From his saddlebag, he drew the iron key and turned it in the stiff lock. The door swung inward with a shriek, and the smell of dust, dry rot, and forgotten years rushed out to greet him. He lit a stub of candle, its glow catching on cobwebs stretched like gray lace across the rafters. The house was tired but standing. He could work tired. He set his gear down and stood still, listening. Outside, the wind seemed to fall silent for the briefest heartbeat. In that pause, he felt it: a presence, subtle yet heavy, like eyes pressing against the back of his neck. He turned sharply toward the window. The glass reflected his own candle's glow, but for the flick of a shadow that slipped past the frame. Not a trick of light. Not his imagination. His hand drifted toward the revolver at his hip, though he did not draw it. He was not a jumpy man, yet something told him this land had not been empty for a very long time. He whispered to himself, almost to break the silence, "So this is Hollow Creek." Outside, the last red sun bled over the horizon, and in the abandoned houses beyond, something shifted. A curtain fell back into place, though no wind had touched it. Before this story takes its first turn, tell me, if you had to start over in the wild frontier, where would you stake your claim? Drop it in the comments below. Night settled over Hollow Creek like a heavy quilt stitched from silence. The stars blinked cold and indifferent above, while the wind funneled through the empty street with a low, mournful whistle. Elias Vaynor sat on the farmhouse porch, his hat tipped forward, revolver resting near his thigh. He told himself he'd left the weapon close out of habit, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. The town wasn't dead. It was holding its breath. From the porch, he could see the outlines of other buildings. A leaning saloon with its doors unhinged, the skeletal frame of a blacksmith's shop, and the faint silhouette of a chapel whose steeple pierced the night like a broken spear. The place was ruined, yes, but it was not abandoned. He caught movement again, this time in the cracked window of the saloon. A slow pass of shadow, deliberate, as though it wanted to be seen. Elias stiffened, hand grazing the grip of his Colt, but he held back. Whoever was out there wasn't hiding. They were watching. The mare, tethered to the post, stamped nervously, ears swiveling. Her instincts were sharper than his, and right now, every muscle in her body screamed of company. Elias rose, boots crunching against the boards, his eyes fixed on the window, but when he blinked, the shadow was gone. "Too much road dust," he muttered, though the words felt hollow even in his own mouth. He stepped off the porch and moved cautiously down the street. The silence pressed closer the further he went, like walking into the lungs of something vast and waiting. Each house he passed bore signs of recent disturbance: curtains pulled back, footprints in the dust, too fresh for the years this place was meant to have been empty. At the corner, he paused. A whisper floated in the air, faint, drawn out, like the echo of women speaking in low prayer. It came from the chapel. Elias's spine tightened. He knew the sound of prayers well enough, though these words were unlike any hymn he'd heard on the trail. They weren't English. Not fully, but a tangled language that felt older, heavier. The whispering stopped as abruptly as it began. The air grew still, as though the town itself listened. Elias squinted at the chapel, its doorway black as a throat. Something shifted inside, tall, broader than any figure had a right to be. He drew his Colt now, not for show but survival. The barrel glinted in the moonlight, steady in his hand despite the thrum in his chest. Then glass shattered. From the saloon's second floor, a window burst outward, shards spilling into the dirt street. Elias spun, weapon raised. Nothing emerged, only silence. He lowered the gun slowly, but the truth clamped around him like a trap. Hollow Creek was not empty, and whatever claimed it was, letting him know he was no longer alone. By dawn, the wind had shifted, carrying the acrid bite of smoke. Elias Vaynor stepped into the street, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat. The fire wasn't from his hearth. The smoke was fresher, darker, curling up from the chapel like the breath of something long buried. He approached slowly, revolver holstered but hand ready. The chapel's doors gaped open, one dangling by rusted hinges. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of burning sage, and something sharper, metallic, that turned his stomach. Ashes glowed faintly in a stone pit, dug right into the floorboards. Someone had been here. Someone still was. Bootsteps creaked above him. Elias looked up at the balcony. Shadows moved with purpose, tall forms gliding against the fractured light, spilling through the stained glass. Then, silence followed by the unmistakable groan of the balcony stair. They emerged slowly. Women, no, giants. Towering figures draped in black veils and faded dresses, their shoulders broad as fence posts, their hair bound in braids that brushed their hips. Their faces, pale and drawn, carried the weight of years, though their eyes burned with unsettling vitality. Elias froze. He had seen tall men in his life, but nothing like this. Each of them stood near a head taller than him, and he was no small man. Their presence filled the chapel, pressing the air thin. The one in front lowered her veil. Her cheekbones were sharp, her gaze unblinking, her lips cracked from years of silence. "You have come," she said, her voice deep, almost resonant, as if the chapel's walls themselves carried her words. Elias steadied himself. Bought this land fair from a man who swore it was empty, didn't expect company. The woman's eyes flicked to the revolver at his side, then back to his face. A faint smile tugged at her lips, though it held no warmth. "Empty?" she repeated, her tone rolling like thunder. "Nothing here has been empty, only waiting." Behind her, the other widows stirred. One whispered words Elias couldn't catch, her voice like dry reeds rattling in the wind. Another clutched a bundle of dried herbs, tossing it into the smoldering pit. The flames hissed, and smoke coiled upward, thick and choking. Elias stepped back, hand brushing his Colt again. "I don't want trouble, just came for quiet. If this place is yours, I'll leave it." The leader tilted her head, studying him as though he were cattle up for auction. Then she spoke again, slower, weightier. "You are here because you were meant to be here." Elias's jaw tightened. "Meant by who?" A ripple moved through the widows, their veils shifting like wings. The leader's answer came sharp as a blade. By us. The chapel seemed to groan under the weight of her words. And in that moment, Elias understood the land hadn't been sold to him. It had delivered him. Elias Vaynor had faced down armed men in mining camps, drunken gunmen in saloons, even outlaws who laughed in the face of death, but standing before the widows of Hollow Creek was different. Their silence pressed harder than gun barrels, their eyes more piercing than any drawn blade. The leader moved closer, her height casting him in shadow. She stopped just short of touching him, the hem of her dress brushing the chapel's dusty floorboards. Her voice, low and resonant, filled the hollow room. "You ask who meant you to come," she said. "It was not a chance. Men do not arrive at Hollow Creek unless Hollow Creek calls them." Elias's hand twitched near his revolver, though he knew firing would do little good against women who looked as though they could snap a man in two with bare hands. He kept his voice steady. "I came here by deed and coin, nothing more. A man in Redford sold me this place." Murmurs rippled through the veiled women. The leader's gaze hardened. "There has been no man in Redford with claim to this land for nearly 20 years. You bought nothing, wanderer. You were given." The word cut through him like cold steel. Given. Another widow stepped forward, older, her face lined and stern. Her veil slipped just enough to show lips pressed thin. "When our husbands were taken by sickness, by war, by this cursed land itself, we were left with nothing. Nothing but sighs, strength, and hunger." Her voice trembled at the last word. Hunger. A third spoke, her eyes wet with rage. "We buried them all, one by one. No sons grew to replace them. No brothers rode in from afar. For years we waited, hoping men would come to Hollow Creek. None came, until you." Elias exhaled, slow and deliberate. The truth was sinking in like rain into parched soil. These women were not just survivors, they were a clan, bound to this dead town by grief, tradition, and something darker still. The leader lifted her chin, and her words carried like a sermon. "Our bloodline cannot end. The earth itself denies us rest until it continues. So when a man comes, he is no owner, no wanderer, no stranger. He is chosen. He belongs to us." The chapel seemed to tighten around him, its walls groaning as though agreeing with her claim. Elias's chest felt heavy, the air thick with smoke and expectation. "You'll forgive me," he said, voice edged with iron. "But I didn't ride 100 miles to be claimed like a piece of cattle." The women did not flinch at his defiance. In fact, several smiled thin, joyless smiles that spoke of inevitability. The leader's eyes burned steadily into his. "Defiance is nothing new to us, Elias Vaynor. But when the sun falls, tradition rises, and you will learn what it means to belong to Hollow Creek." The flames in the pit flared, sending sparks licking up toward the broken rafters. Elias backed a step, every instinct telling him he was caught in something far larger than he understood. And then the leader whispered the words that froze him in place. "Tonight, the fire will burn, and the ritual will begin." By nightfall, Hollow Creek was no longer silent. Elias Vaynor stood on the edge of the main street, watching orange light ripple against the darkness. The widows had built a bonfire in the open square, its flames leaping high enough to lick at the cracked sign of the old mercantile. Sparks swirled into the night like frantic fireflies, and the smoke carried a stench of sage, pine pitch, and something far older that made his skin crawl. The widows moved in a slow circle around the fire. Their veils and black dresses caught the glow, their towering forms casting shadows that stretched across every broken wall and doorframe. From a distance, they might have looked like mourners at a funeral. Up close, they looked like executioners, waiting for the condemned to step forward. Elias stood his ground, hand resting on the butt of his revolver. He could feel their eyes sweep over him again and again, measuring, weighing. He had walked into ambushes before, but this was different. There were no pistols drawn, no blades brandished, just a strange, suffocating certainty that he had already been claimed. The leader, the one who had spoken in the chapel, raised her arms. Her voice boomed across the square. Not shouted, but deep enough to carry through wood, bone, and stone. Tonight, Hollow Creek remembers. The circle of women answered in unison, their chant low, throaty, and unsettling. Words rolled from their tongues in a language Elias could not place, part prayer, part demand. He didn't need to understand the meaning. The intent was enough. The mare tied to the hitching post screamed and fought against her reins. Elias's heart clenched, but he dared not move. To run toward her would mean turning his back on the firelit circle, and something in him knew better. The leader lowered her arms and fixed her burning gaze on him. The chant hushed. All that remained was the crackle of fire and the pounding of his own blood in his ears. "You ask why you were brought here," she said. "It is because the line must not end. We are widows of Hollow Creek, bound to a covenant older than the soil. For years the earth has been barren." But tonight she took a step toward him, each footfall heavy as a hammer. "Tonight the earth shall be fed, tonight the fire bears witness." Elias clenched his jaw. "You're out of your mind. I came for a homestead, not whatever this island." A ripple of cold laughter drifted through the circle. The women drew closer, their faces gleaming in the firelight, eyes sharp with hunger, with need. The leader stopped only a breath away from him. Her voice dropped low, steady as iron. "The breeding starts tonight." The fire cracked and roared higher, and every widow turned her gaze on Elias. Elias Vaynor did not scare easily, but the weight of so many eyes locked on him pressed harder than any ambush he'd ever walked into. The fire roared, the circle tightened, and the leader's words still hung in the air like a noose. "The breeding starts tonight." His fingers flexed over the worn grip of his Colt. He could draw, he was fast enough, but deep down he knew the bullet would do little against a dozen towering women whose hunger looked stronger than steel. If he shot one, the rest would fall on him, and Hollow Creek would be his grave. So he straightened instead, lifting his chin, voice steady as stone. "You've had your say," Elias called into the circle. "But I'm not a calf led to branding, nor a prize to be passed around. I'm a man, and no fire, no chant, no curse changes that." A hiss of disapproval ran through the widows. Some clutched their veils tighter. Others bared their teeth in something between a snarl and a smile. But not all. Elias caught the flicker of doubt in a few faces, the way two of the women exchanged uneasy glances. The leader moved closer, her shadow swallowing him. "You dare defy the covenant?" "I dare remind you," Elias answered, his voice low, sharp, "that men don't bend easily. If you try to force me, you'll break more than your tradition. You'll break Hollow Creek all over again." The words cut deeper than he expected. One of the younger widows, her cheeks hollow, her braid swinging long over her shoulder, stepped forward with trembling hands. "Sister, perhaps." "Silence!" the leader thundered, and the younger one fell back, eyes lowered. Elias saw it, then this was no single will. The widows were bound together, yes, but cracks ran through them. Some were desperate, clinging to old rights. Others seemed torn, trapped by traditions too heavy to carry, but too fearful to cast aside. He seized the moment. "You say I was meant to be here. Maybe so, but not as your prisoner." His gaze swept the circle, landing on every flickering, uncertain eye. "If Hollow Creek wants a man, then it wants a man who stands. And that's what I am." The fire popped, sending sparks skyward. For a moment the chant ceased. The silence that followed was thicker than smoke. Finally, the leader lowered her gaze to him, voice colder than stone. "If you will not submit, then you will prove yourself. Survive the night in Hollow Creek alone, and perhaps you are more than a wanderer. Fail, and the earth will claim you." The circle opened. a path back into the darkness yawning before him. Elias's jaw tightened. He holstered his Colt, meeting the leader's burning eyes without flinching. "Fine," he said. "If it's survival you want, I've made a life out of it." The widows stepped back, their shadows slithering in the firelight. Somewhere in the black beyond the flames, the town itself seemed to stir. Elias turned into the darkness, every instinct telling him the trial had already begun. The firelight faded behind him, swallowed by the black throat of Hollow Creek. Elias Vaynor walked with his hand near his revolver, boots crunching on broken earth, ears straining for any sound beyond the whisper of wind. "Survive the night," they had said. The moon hung low, painting the ghost town in pale silver. Roofs sagged like weary shoulders, doors swayed on hinges, and the old well in the square glistened with dew. Every creak of timber, every gust rattling loose shutters, felt alive, as if the whole town leaned forward to watch. He had camped alone in canyons where wolves circled and heard the wail of coyotes in dark ravines. But this silence was heavier, threaded with something more human footsteps that stopped when he stopped. Whispers that darted just outside the reach of sense. Elias turned sharply, Colt half drawn. The street lay empty. Dust settled around him. Then movement. A tall figure slipped between two houses, a veil glimmering faintly in the moonlight. Another shadow loomed by the blacksmith's forge, then vanished when his eyes fixed on it. They weren't hiding. They were stalking. "Fine," Elias muttered, steadying his breath. "If it's a hunt you want." He stepped into the alley between the houses, narrow and dark, the stench of mildew clinging to the walls. Boards creaked above, too heavy to be rats. Elias spun, pistol raised. A widow dropped down from the roof behind him. The ground shook with her weight. She was close enough to seize him, her hand larger than his head, but she hesitated. Her breath rattled, her eyes wide, not with rage but with something else. "Recognition," she whispered, almost too soft for him to hear. "Run." And then she melted back into shadow, leaving him standing alone, heart pounding like a war drum. Elias's pulse hammered. They could have ended him, right there. But one chose not to. Why? Mercy? Or was this trial not meant to kill him at all, but to measure him? He pressed onward, crossing into the shell of the saloon. The floor groaned under his boots, the smell of stale whiskey and rot filling his nose. Moonlight spilled through broken slats, casting long stripes across the room. He froze. Figures moved in every corner, tall, looming, silent. At least 3 of them, watching from the edges of the light. Elias lifted his revolver. "You're gonna have to do more than stare." The widows shifted, circling him, their veils whispering against their dresses. One reached for him, fingers brushing his shoulder like a brand of ice. He shoved back hard, breaking free, stumbling into the street again. His chest burned with adrenaline, his mind racing. The trial wasn't just survival. It was a game, a test of his will, his spirit, and somewhere among these towering figures, one had spared him. The hunt wasn't over. The night had just begun. The moon crept higher, silvering Hollow Creek in a ghostly glow. Elias Vaynor leaned against a weathered post outside the saloon, breath ragged, revolver steady in his hand. He had evaded, fought, and run, but the widows still closed in, their shadows trailing him like wolves circling a campfire. The night pressed heavy, yet in the pauses between their movements, Elias caught something strange. Hesitation. Not all of them moved with the same hunger. Some lingered at the edges, watching but not striking, as though bound by rules he didn't yet understand. A whisper floated to him, softer than the others. "This way." Elias froze. The voice had not come from behind or beside him, but from the narrow frame of the old schoolhouse, its door cracked just enough for moonlight to spill through. He raised his Colt, eyes narrowing. "Show yourself." The door creaked wider, and she stepped out. Taller than any woman he had known, yet younger than the others, her face was pale but unlined, her dark braid hanging heavy over one shoulder. Unlike the others, her veil had been cast aside. Her eyes, though enormous and unblinking, did not burn with the same fevered fire. They shimmered instead with unease, even sorrow. "You'll die if you keep fighting them all," she said, voice low, urgent. Elias kept the gun trained. "Then why'd one of you let me run? Was that you?" She gave a single nod, gaze never leaving his. "The covenant binds us, but not all of us believe in it anymore. Some are desperate, some are afraid. Me, I'm just tired." Elias studied her, the barrel of his Colt steady, though his thoughts churned. She could have tackled him, dragged him into whatever rite they were preparing. Instead, she stood unarmed, speaking truth where the others spoke only tradition. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Her lips trembled before she answered. Not what they want, not what she. Her eyes flicked toward the chapel, where the leader still watched demands. "I only want this to end." The words landed heavy. Elias saw it now. Behind the towering presence and the black dresses, these widows were prisoners too, bound by vows spoken long before this night. He lowered the Colt, though his grip stayed firm. "What's your name?" "Moran." The name lingered in the silence between them. For the first time since stepping into Hollow Creek, Elias felt something other than a threat pressing at him, an opening, a fracture in the wall of tradition. "You help me live through this night," Elias said, voice steady, "and maybe there's a way out for both of us." Marian's eyes glistened, though she quickly hid it, straightening her tall frame. "Be careful. At dawn, the covenant demands the ritual. If you defy them again, they'll kill you." Her words chilled him, but the fire in her gaze told him more. She didn't want him dead. She wanted a choice. And as the night stretched on, Elias realized she might be the only ally he had left in Hollow Creek. The first streaks of dawn bled across the horizon, cold light spilling over the roofs of Hollow Creek. The bonfire had burned low through the night, leaving only coals that pulsed like a dying heart. Elias Vaynor stood in the square, boots planted, revolver at his side. His muscles ached from the long chase, but his spirit held. He hadn't broken. The widows emerged one by one, silent as specters, forming a half-circle around him. Their dresses swayed in the morning wind, their veils trailing like mourning banners. They did not look weary. If anything, the light made them more terrible faces, carved with grief and hunger, eyes glowing with the kind of resolve that does not falter. At their head stood the leader. Her presence swallowed the square, her gaze fixed on Elias with grim certainty. "The covenant does not bend," she declared, voice carrying like the toll of a church bell. "The man who enters Hollow Creek must be claimed, or the land withers forever." Murmurs rose among them. Some echoed her words with fierce agreement, but others shifted uneasily, their glances darting toward Elias, as though questioning the weight of what they were about to do. Marian stood near the back, her veil discarded, her braid loose around her shoulders. She said nothing, but her eyes never left Elias. In them, he saw fear, but also defiance. Elias's voice cut through the morning stillness. "You lost your men, your kin, your future. I get it. But you don't fix loss by chaining another soul to it. You fix it by building something new, together, with choice, not force." The leader's jaw clenched. "You speak like a man who thinks himself free, but freedom is a lie when the earth demands otherwise." Elias drew his revolver, not to fire, but to make clear his line. "I'll die on my feet before I live on my knees. That's the only covenant I'll ever keep." The circle shifted. Several widows advanced, their towering frames blotting out the dawn. The trial had ended. Now comes judgment. Then Marian stepped forward. "Enough." Her voice cracked like a whip, halting even the leader for a breath. She strode between Elias and the circle, her height making her look like a wall of defiance. "We've suffered, yes, but binding him won't heal us. It will only chain us tighter to a curse we never chose. The square quivered with tension. 2 widows hissed, their veils whipping in the wind, while others stood frozen, torn between tradition and truth. The leader's face hardened. Marian, you betray us. I refuse to bury myself alive, Marian answered. Her voice trembled, but her stance held strong. If Hollow Creek must live, it won't be through another death. It'll be a new beginning. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hiss of dying coals. Elias stepped up beside her, revolver steady, his voice iron. Then here's my vow. I won't be claimed, but I will stand. I'll rebuild this place with anyone willing to live free. That's the only future I'll give. The dawn broke fully then, spilling gold into the square. The widows' faces glowed in the light, torn between rage and revelation. The covenant itself seemed to teeter, one breath away from shattering. The sun climbed, washing Hollow Creek in pale gold, and with it the old town seemed to breathe again. Smoke drifted thin from the dying coals, shadows peeled back from broken walls, and the faces of the widows stood clear in the morning light. For the first time since he arrived, Elias Vaynor saw them not as phantoms, but as women weathered by grief, carved by loss, held captive by tradition that had become a cage. The leader's gaze bore down on him, cold and unyielding. You would tear apart what has bound us for generations? She asked. Without the covenant, we are nothing. Without it, Hollow Creek dies. Elias met her stare without flinching. Hollow Creek died when you buried yourselves in ritual instead of life. You wanted to live? Then build again. Work the soil. Raise homes, not bonfires. Take your strength and use it for more than fear. The widows shifted uneasily. Some looked to the leader, others to Marian, whose tall frame stood firm beside Elias. Her voice carried across the square, steadier now than in the dark of night. He's right. We've clung to ash and bones, but we are not powerless. We are not cursed. We can choose. She turned to her sisters, eyes bright in the sun. We can live. A murmur swept the circle. 2 widows stepped back, uncertainty breaking their rigid faces. Another wept quietly, clutching her veil. Yet others hissed, their anger sharp as the crack of a whip. The leader's expression hardened to stone. If you abandon the covenant, you abandon me. So be it, Marian said, her voice ringing. Silence followed, broken only by the wind rattling the empty windows of the town. Then, slowly, 3 widows stepped toward Marian and Elias. Their movements were hesitant, but their choice was clear. They had had enough of graves, enough of hunger, enough of chains disguised as duty. The leader's eyes blazed with fury, but she did not strike. She turned her face away, veil whipping in the wind. Then Hollow Creek is broken. May the earth take the rest of you. With that, she and 2 others vanished into the chapel shadow, their towering forms swallowed by darkness. Elias holstered his revolver. His voice, though worn, carried like iron. Let them go. Whoever stays, stays by choice. And that's how this town starts again. The remaining widows, few, but enough, stood tall in the morning light, their faces marked with fear, but also with the faintest glimmer of hope. For the first time, Elias saw possibility in their eyes. Marian looked at him, her lips trembling with a question she didn't speak. Elias answered it anyway, his words quiet but firm. We'll build something new. Together. The sun broke fully over the ridge, spilling warmth into the square. The night was gone, the fire reduced to ash, and Hollow Creek stood at the edge of a different kind of covenant, not one bound in fear, but in choice. And for Elias Vaynor, a weary cowboy who came seeking peace, the broken town had given him more than a homestead. It had given him a purpose. If you thought these were crazy, you won't want to miss what happens in this next video.